The door handle dipped before I touched it. Not a rattle, not a jerk, just pressure, slow and careful, as if something on the other side was learning how much resistance it needed to make me notice. I stopped breathing without deciding to, fingers hovering inches from the cold metal, watching the handle ease back into place on its own. At the same moment, the forest went silent. Not gradually, completely. No wind in the trees, no insects. Just the ticking of cooling metal and the sound of blood pushing too hard through my ears. I didn't understand what that meant, yet I stayed, like that longer than made sense, eyes fixed on my reflection in the darkened window. It wavered slightly with each shallow breath, a pale shape floating over the suggestion of trees behind me. I half expected it to move on its own. When it didn't, that almost felt worse. I withdrew my hand slowly, listening for any sound that might tell me I'd imagined the whole thing. Nothing answered. I was parked on an old maintenance road that cut across the upper basin, the kind of road that still shows up on maps long after people stop using it. The mountains folded inward here, creating a wide, shallow bowl of trapped weather and sound in ways that never felt accidental. I'd driven up just before dusk, killing the engine early and coasting the last few yards so the noise wouldn't carry. Habit, not caution. I told myself that mattered. The moon hadn't cleared the ridgeline yet, but the light was already wronged present, seeping into the basin in thin silver bands as if it had arrived early and was waiting to be acknowledged. I stepped out of the truck and closed the door carefully. The sound died faster than it should have, swallowed whole by the quiet. That was the second thing that didn't fit, and I noticed it only because my body tightened before my mind caught up. The air smelled clean at first, cold, pine and stone and old frost. I breathed it in and waited for the tension to ease. It didn't. My spine felt tight, as if something had been wound there and left to wait. I rolled my shoulders once, then again, trying to shake the sensation loose. It stayed. I set my pack on the tailgate and paused with my hands resting on the metal. The truck felt solid, real, something that belonged to the world I understood. I left the lantern unlit. Light draws attention, and attention wasn't what I wanted tonight. I unfolded the map instead, smoothing the creases with my palm even, though I already knew where I was. North of the quarry road, east of the burned-out ranger station, far enough from town that no one would hear anything worth calling about. I told myself I was here for distance. Distance from people, distance from noise, distance from the way the moon pulled at me every month, like a question that wouldn't stop asking itself. That explanation had worked for years. It worked now, if I didn't examine it too closely. The birds had stopped. I didn't notice it right away. The absence crept in slowly enough that my mind tried to fill it with excuses, with a shift, predator nearby, normal mountain behavior. Then I realized I was counting seconds between sounds that weren't coming back. No wing beats, no calls, not even the faint rustle of something small moving through underbrush. The basin felt held, like a breath drawn and not released. I took a few steps away from the truck, boots crunching softly on frosted gravel. The sound felt loud, wrong, like I'd broken a rule I hadn't been told about yet. I stopped again, scanning the tree line. Everything looked the way it should have. That was the problem. When the moon finally crested the ridge, it didn't explode into the sky the way people expect. It simply arrived, whole and bright, spilling light into the low places, as if it had always been there and I'd only just bothered to look. Frost caught it and threw it back in thin, sharp lines. The basin began to glow in pieces, a map of veins and scars etched into the ground. The pressure in my spine flared, sudden and precise. I sucked in a breath through my teeth and leaned against the truck until it passed. That sensation wasn't new. It had been my calendar for decades, a reminder that no matter how far I went or how carefully I lived, certain things followed. I'd paid a high price to make that pain manageable. Silver grafts fused into bone. Rituals that didn't care whether you believed in them as long as you obeyed the rules. I believed the lock they'd built was permanent. The first howl came from far off. Thin and wrong, stretched too tight through a throat that wasn't ready for it. It cut off abruptly, like a line snapped under tension. I waited for an echo. None came. The silence that followed pressed down harder than the sound itself, and I realized my hands had curled into fists without my permission. A second howl answered from the opposite ridge, deeper, steadier. It carried weight, authority. It rolled across the basin and settled into my chest, vibrating there in a way I felt more than heard. The third didn't wait its turn. It rose from somewhere closer, fractured and frantic, overlapping the deeper call like an argument breaking out in the dark. By the time the fourth joined them, they were coming from everywhere, not together, not in any pattern that suggested coordination. They layered over one another, some climbing too high and breaking apart mid-note, others holding steady as if whoever made them knew exactly how much sound to give and when to stop. My mouth tasted like copper. I pressed my palm flat against the truck again and felt a faint vibration through the metal. A low hum that had no business being there yet. I told myself it was memory, trauma stored in the body, the way scars ache when weather changes even after the wound is gone. That explanation had carried me through nights like this before. It worked until the ground answered the howls. At first, it was subtle a vibration you could mistake for wind moving through roots. Then it deepened, settling into bone and joint, a low resonance that made my teeth rattle. The silver in my spine burned in response, heat tracing the grafts in a clean, deliberate line. This wasn't the familiar flare at the edge of a full moon. This was pressure applied evenly, as if something were testing the seams. Something moved at the far edge of the basin. I didn't see a body. I saw the effect of one. Trees shuddered as if brushed by something heavy. Shadows stretched and snapped back into place. The air shifted, carrying a smell that didn't belong, yet hot iron, wet fur, stone struck too hard. I took a step back without meaning to, heel catching on gravel. The sound echoed too clearly in a place that had decided not to answer back. The first transformation finished close enough that I heard bone forcing itself into a new arrangement. There was no grace to it, no smooth stretch. It was a detonation crack, a wet sound I felt in my gut. The howl that followed was raw and incomplete, the kind that comes from a throat still learning how to hold the sound. Another answered almost immediately. Then it cut off. I knew that sound. I knew what it meant when a voice didn't get to finish. Across the basin, shapes moved where shapes shouldn't have been able to move that way. My eyes slid off details that refused to settle into anything coherent. I saw impacts instead. Trees bent and snapped, rocks fractured under weight that didn't bounce. Somewhere to my left, a transformation took too long. I heard the human part fighting for breath. Pleading threaded through the sound as the other thing built itself piece by piece, patient and exacting. When it finally broke free, the noise that followed wasn't relief. It was rage, focused, immediate. It turned without hesitation toward the nearest answer. They weren't hunting people. The realization landed cold and clear, cutting through the noise. Calls cut off mid-note, not because they'd been answered, but because they'd been silenced. The basin fractured into smaller fights, each resolving quickly, brutally, without ceremony. Old patterns broke apart as fast as bodies were changing. I saw a smaller shape rush, a larger one, and get thrown aside like it had misjudged gravity. I saw to meet head and unlock there, neither willing to give. both howling through clenched teeth until one voice failed. The pressure in my spine became unbearable. Heat bloomed along the grafts, no longer flaring and fading, but settling into a constant burn that matched my heartbeat. Each pulse felt like a test. Each pause between them felt like a warning. I locked the truck doors with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. A pair of eyes flared to life in the side mirror, low and off-center, watching not me but my reflection. They didn't blink. They didn't advance. They waited. We should have stopped right there. The waiting stretched. It didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate, like a pause taken to see who would break first. I stood there with my back to the truck, eyes locked on the mirror, even after the eyes there dimmed and vanished, leaving only my own reflection staring back too hard. My breath fogged the glass in short bursts. I tried to slow it. It didn't. Listen. A sound came from the trees to my right, not a step. Not quite. More like weight being set down carefully, then lifted again. The frost didn't crunch. Whatever it was knew where to place itself. I turned my head a few degrees at a time, refusing to give it the satisfaction of a full reaction. Nothing moved where I was looking. The sound came again, closer now, and my spine answered with a spike of heat that made my vision blur. I told myself it was one of the survivors repositioning, a wolf circling to assess a threat it hadn't decided to engage yet. That explanation held until the sound came from the opposite side as well, overlapping just enough to break the illusion. Two positions, two angles, neither committing. The ground vibrated again, shallow this time, like a warning tapped out through stone. Somewhere uphill, something large shifted its weight. The howls had stopped entirely. The silence that replaced them wasn't relief, it was attention. I became acutely aware of how exposed the basin was, how the bowl shape funneled movement and sound toward the center where I stood. I stepped backward without looking, hand brushing the truck's tailgate, grounding myself in cold metal again. A shape crossed the headlight beams too fast for my eyes to follow cleanly. Fur caught the moonlight and vanished. No impact, no sound. Just confirmation that something had tested the space and learned what it needed. My pulse jumped. The silver burned hotter, tracing the grafts in a line that felt almost curious, as if the pressure were being adjusted rather than applied. Another micro shift in the trees, this one higher up. Branches flexed without breaking. Whatever moved there didn't need to force its way through. It chose paths that already existed. The smell reached me next, carried on air that had finally remembered how to move, heart iron layered over wet fur, sharper now, closer. I swallowed and tasted copper again. The first actual intrusion came quietly. A scrape along the truck's hood, light enough to leave only a faint line in the frost. It didn't dig in, it didn't tear, it traced. I flinched despite myself, and somewhere in the dark something adjusted its stance, recalibrating. The lesson was immediate and humiliating. Reaction mattered. A second scrape followed, this one lower, near the wheel well. The metal creaked under the pressure, just enough to tell me how much force was being withheld. I clenched my jaw and stayed still, forcing my hands to unclench one finger at a time. The pressure in my spine pulsed in approval, a warning eye couldn't tell which dot movement again, this time behind me. I felt it before I heard it, a displacement of air that brushed the back of my neck. I spun, heart slamming, and saw nothing but trees and moonlight. The basin looked unchanged. That was the point. The intrusion wasn't about damage. It was about positioning. Something exhaled near my left ear, not a growl, not a threat. A breath, slow and controlled, testing how close it could get without provoking a mistake. My vision tunneled, The wolf pressed hard against the inside of my skin. A surge of instinct that wanted to turn and strike, to end the waiting by force. The silver flared in response, pain sharp and precise, reminding me why that instinct had been locked away. I forced myself to step forward instead of back, breaking the geometry they'd built around me. Gravel crunched loudly under my boot. The sound echoed and died too fast. The breath near my ear vanished. The pressure shifted. I changed the board just enough to see if it mattered. It did. A low sound rolled through the basin. Not a howl, but a note held deep in the chest, resonant enough to make my ribs vibrate. It came from uphill, from the ridgeline I'd avoided, looking at directly. The ground answered with a deeper tremor, and the silver in my spine screamed as if something had finally found the seam it wanted. The grafts heeded past pain into something sharper, more urgent. My knees buckled. I caught myself on the truck, palms slapping metal hard enough to leave prints in the frost. My reflection in the window warped, stretched by my own movement, and for a heartbeat it didn't move when I did. Its eyes burned brighter than mine. That was when it changed. The waiting stopped being passive. The intrusions overlapped now, not resolving, not escalating into attack, but compressing the space around me. One presence shifted uphill, another downhill. A third brushed past the truck again, this time hard enough to rock it slightly. The mirror flexed inward and snapped back. Still no strike. Still no release. The howl that came next wasn't from the basin at all. It rolled down from above, layered and heavy, a sound no single throat could make. It wasn't a challenge, it was a summons. Everything else answered that, not in defiance. In acknowledgement, bodies that had been circling froze mid-motion. Those that had been repositioning settled. The pressure in my spine aligned with the sound, the silver burning in a pattern. That felt deliberate. This wasn't chaos, it was a gathering. I understood then why the transformations had been uneven, why some had finished cleanly and others had dragged on in agony. This night wasn't about numbers, it was about fit. The presence on the ridge moved again, and this time I saw part of it clearly enough to know I couldn't understand the whole. A shoulder caught the moonlight and disappeared. Fur shifted independently of the body it belonged to. Eyes burned with a steady patience that didn't flicker when others rushed it and broke against it moments later. The basin's remaining shapes turned their attention upward, instinct pulling them into alignment whether they wanted it or not. The silver in my spine reached a breaking point. Heat surged, no longer testing but insisting. My back arched against my will. A sound tore out of me, half scream, half snarl, and I bit down hard enough to draw blood to keep from giving it more. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't chance. It was succession asserting itself. I didn't realize what it had already done. The pressure didn't break all at once. It shifted, tightened, then settled into a rhythm that matched the low, layered sound still rolling down from the ridge. Each pulse drove heat deeper along the silver grafts in my spine, no longer probing but prying. As if the metal were being asked a question it could no longer refuse to answer. I sank to one knee, breath tearing out of me in short, ugly bursts, fingers digging into frozen gravel hard enough to numb. The basin moved again. Not in a rush, in a correction. One presence peeled away downhill, slipping through the trees with the smooth efficiency of something that knew exactly where it was allowed to be. Another repositioned uphill, higher now, cutting off a line of escape I hadn't consciously plotted but my body had already mapped. A third remained close, just out of sight, its breath occasionally brushing the air near my face, reminding me how narrow my world had become. My thoughts fractured under the pressure, not confusion too, much clarity. I knew distances without measuring them. I knew which sounds were old and which were new. I knew with a certainty that felt borrowed that nothing here was improvising anymore. The wolf pressed harder against the inside of my skin, not raging yet, just waiting, coiled and attentive. The silver screamed in protest, and for the first time since the rites had been completed, I felt it flex. I reached back without fully deciding to. My fingers found the scar lined by memory alone, skin hot enough to blister, the metal beneath it burning like it had been waiting for this exact moment. The thought of stopping crossed my mind and vanished just as quickly. Stopping wasn't an option, the night recognized. I pulled. The pain was clean and absolute, a white line drawn straight through me that erased everything else for a heartbeat. The grafts tore free with a sound like ice splitting on a frozen lake. Heat rushed into the space they'd left, violent and immediate, and the wolf surged forward to claim it. Bones detonated outward, not stretching, but breaking and rebuilding in the same breath. My spine restructured itself around a different balance point, vertebrae grinding and snapping into a shape that felt horrifyingly correct. Skin split along my arms and sealed again, split again as muscle forced its way through, denser and stronger with each pass. Teeth grew, shattered under the pressure of my jaw clenching too hard, then regrew, sharper, longer, settling into place like they'd always belonged there. The rage came in waves, not blind, not chaotic, ancestral, every hunt carried in the blood, every betrayal remembered by bone. Every village burned and blade buried and oath broken pressed into the moment like a thumb on a bruise. The human part of me didn't vanish. It screamed, trapped behind my eyes, forced to witness as my body remembered what it had been designed to do long before it learned how to be anything else. I burst forward and hit the ground on all fours, the impact cracking frost-hardened soil and sending a shock through my newly rebalanced frame. The world reassembled itself around new senses. Fear had weight now, dominance had a direction. Old blood soaked into stone left trails I could follow without seeing them. The presence on the ridge shifted again. This time, it didn't hide. I couldn't see all of it at once. My eyes refused to hold the shape, but parts resolved as it moved. A massive shoulder, fur-layered and scarred, sliding through moonlight. A forearm that bent wrong, too long, too heavy, carrying the impression of many others beneath it. Eyes burned with moonfire, steady and patient, watching me not as prey, but as a problem to be measured. The first howl didn't charge. It pressed, the force of it hit like a moving wall. Mass and will combined, shoving me backward through saplings and stone, until the edges of my vision went white. I rolled, came up, snarling, claws biting into rock to stop the slide. The wolf surged, eager now, and I let it, channeling the rage into movement instead of noise. We collided again near the basin's center, ground already torn apart by earlier clashes. I leapt and felt its grip close around me, not crushing, just holding, testing how much resistance I would give. The pressure was immense, calibrated. I twisted, using leverage instead of strength, and we crashed through a stand of young trees that snapped like kindling under our combined weight. Around us, the last of the basin resolved itself. Shapes that had once been familiar, neighbors, rivals, packmates collapsed into final forms or went still where they fell. A few tried to flee, none made it far. This night had no tolerance for hesitation. Only fit survived. The first howl watched between exchanges, eyes never leaving me, even as it redirected others that rushed it in desperation or defiance. They broke against it and were folded into its movement without slowing it down. When it turned fully toward me again, the pressure returned, heavier than before, pressing at the new seams in my spine as if checking the quality of the work I'd just completed. We circled. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a pool of meltwater half-formed, fur slick with blood that wasn't all mine, eyes burning with a light I didn't recognize. The human part recoiled. The wolf didn't care. It surged forward, and this time the clash sent a shockwave through the valley that stripped bark from trunks and scattered debris in a wide arc. The sound that tore out of me then wasn't a howl or a scream. It was something between a declaration without language. The first howl answered, layered voices rising and falling in agreement rather than challenge. For a moment, the basin seemed to hold its breath. When we broke apart, it didn't come at me again. The first howl circled once, slow and deliberate, then turned its attention away, toward the ridge and whatever lay beyond it. Succession acknowledged. Not finished, never finished, but accepted for now. The remaining shapes scattered or went still. The pressure eased just enough for me to notice it. A fractional release that felt like a verdict deferred rather than granted. The moon hung low and red, watching with the same patience it always has. When it finally began to sink, the light thinned and the basin exhaled, sound creeping back in piece by piece, as if testing whether it was safe to exist again. Dawn came quietly, it always does, even after nights like this. Pale light spilled over the ridgeline and settled into the scars we'd left behind. Steam rose where blood met frost. The basin looked smaller in daylight, ordinary in a way that felt like an insult. I stood among the aftermath, breath coming hard. The wolf still pressed tight against my skin, unwilling to give up the ground it had taken. The silver was gone. I felt its absence as a steadier weight, a balance point that refused to shift. The pain I'd lived with for decades had been replaced by something heavier and more exacting, a constant awareness of edges and thresholds. I tested my hands, my footing, the way my back moved when I straightened. Everything worked. That worried me more than anything else. I moved back toward the truck on instincts that were no longer entirely mine, scanning, listening, counting breaths. The cab smelled like oil and wet canvas and blood. I sat there longer than made sense, hands on the wheel, waiting for the familiar ache that usually followed a full moon. It didn't come. Silence isn't neutral anymore. It's a signal. I lock doors I don't plan to use. I check reflections twice, 3 times, watching for the moment when timing slips. Moonlight feels heavier on my skin, now not painful, just insistent, like a hand resting there a second too long. I left the mountains by mid-morning, taking back roads until the land flattened and the air lost its edge. People moved around me without noticing anything wrong. They never do. That's the point. I'm telling this now because it isn't finished. The place is still there, quiet again, waiting for the next alignment. Someone else wrote me after this, asked questions that didn't make sense unless they'd felt the same. Silence where they lived. The moon doesn't forget what it crowns. I don't sleep through the night anymore. I lie there and count the spaces between sounds, waiting for the moment when the world holds its breath the way it did in the basin. Silence used to mean rest. Now it means attention. If it lasts too long, I get up and walk the house, barefoot, checking doors I already locked, windows I already secured. I don't rush. Rushing feels like giving something permission. Reflections bother me more than they should. Mirrors, glass storefronts, the dark screen of a television turned off at the wrong angle. I've learned not to look straight at them. I checked from the side first, watching for timing to slip, for movement that doesn't belong to me. It hasn't happened again. That almost makes it worse. Moonlight doesn't hurt, exactly. It presses, I feel it through walls, through curtains, through cloud cover that should soften it, On nights when it's full, I avoid rooms with too many windows. I keep lights low. I don't stand where my shadow can stretch too far behind me. These are small accommodations. They add up. Sometimes, when the house settles, I hear metal shift just a tick, just a creak, and my hand moves before I tell it to. Hovering near a handle, testing resistance that isn't there, I catch myself and force my fingers to relax, one at a time. Normal people would leave a place that makes them live like this. I stay because leaving feels like being followed. I don't tell anyone the details. People who haven't been there listen for the wrong parts. They want spectacle. They want an ending. Once you hear one story like this, really hear it, you stop asking for either. I'm telling it now because the waiting didn't end in the mountains. It just learned my habits.